welcome back to Crime in Court. This is the 1996 Menendez brothers retrial. We are reading through the transcript as we don't have video in this trial. The judge in this case decided in his infinite wisdom to make many, many different decisions, different rulings in this case, and one of those was to not allow cameras in this courtroom. So we are reading through the transcript because that's what we've got. And we're comparing to the first trial, which took place in 93. Which ended in a mistrial. This is their retrial, which ended in convictions, life without parole. As we know, that has been overturned. They now are up for parole in August 20 and 21st. They have parole hearings. And in addition to that, just recently I made the announcement, and I'm going to put it in a separate video too. I did it at the beginning of the last video, but I'll separate it for you guys and put it in the Path to Freedom playlist in case you missed the state's case. When they ended, I went over what the habeas corpus petition means, the rulings from the judge, what's been taking so long. It's been over 2 years since the brothers filed their habeas petition. This is the first time we're actually like seeing movement in it, which is very exciting. The judge has basically ruled in the brothers' favor, stating that he finds their new evidence, which was the letter from Erik to his cousin Andy Cano, um, uh, uh, basically describing the abuse. That was new evidence. The judge found that to be credible, and also the affidavit from Menudo member Roy Rosello found his statements to be credible regarding the allegations of abuse by Jose. So that being said, he finds it credible. He says, "Hey, DA, why should I not allow this habeas petition?" And now not the ball, burden, the burden of proof is is on the prosecution right now to decide whether, what's their legal standing as to how they can get this habeas petition denied. It seems like the judge is in favor of potentially overruling their or at least giving some kind of relief for the habeas, whatever that is, I don't know, but we will continue to follow that, and that is exciting news, and that is also we will know that before the parole hearing because the DA has to give his show cause is what it's called. He has to show cause um, by in the beginning of August. I'm not sure the exact date. We know that the announcement came July 12th, but then the ruling from the judge, wow, that is a loud motorcycle going by, so excuse me for that. That was really loud. I don't know if you guys heard that, but whoo, I did. Um, the ruling itself came July 7th, so he probably has until August 7th, 12th, somewhere in there to get his response back in, and then we shall go from there and find out. So what happens, what the judge decides, seems like he might be in favor of granting some relief. So that's awesome. Awesome news for the brothers. Let's get started. Today, we are moving on to the defense's case. This part, I get excited about the defense's case because I just find it a lot more interesting, exciting. I think it's interesting to see how things get argued and how sometimes, I mean, either side can twist things. And so I like to see how the different versions of events and how things are laid out differently and how sometimes the facts don't line up with what the prosecution is telling you because it seems that way so far. Anywho, let us get started here. Please hit the like button. And so far, we have gone through the entire state's case, which was the span of 7 weeks, almost 6 weeks and a day. So we're gonna move into the defense's case. We're on week 7. Dr. Martin Fackler is who we're going to be hearing from. He's going to be on the stand from November 20th through the 22nd. So he's going to be on the stand for a couple days. He is not just a ballistics consultant, that's what he calls himself in here, but he has been referred to as the father of ballistics wound identification. So he's like a big deal in the area in which he is testifying for the defense. He did not testify in the first trial. Okay, so just bear that in mind as we go into his testimony. We're picking up right where we left off. So, I mean, there was no break in between. It was the state rests, and the people call their next witness, which is Dr. Martin Fackler. And I gotta be careful saying his name. And Ms. Abramson is going to be doing the questioning for Eric's side. All right, so he is sworn in and all that good stuff. The clerk swears him in, he spells his name, and we are on direct examination. Miss Abramson says, Dr. Fackler, what is your occupation, sir? I'm a wound ballistics consultant. It's in that capacity as a wound ballistics consultant that you are testifying in this case. Yes, that's correct. And do you hold any degrees in medicine? Yes, I hold an MD degree. So far, Dr. McCarthy also had a degree, but he wasn't a medical doctor. So far already, this guy supersedes Dr. McCarthy. He's a ballistics expert, which Dr. McCarthy portrayed himself to be, but wasn't on the stand for that. But yet he was allowed to testify to several things that I don't think he should have. And he also testified to a lot of medical opinions that he isn't allowed to have in the court of law because he's not a medical doctor. So already this guy kind of outranks him, if you want to say. And he's not, and like I said, he's not just a ballistics consultant, he's a ballistics wound consultant. And Dr. McCarthy he actually admitted on the stand that this particular expert is excellent in his field. So there's that. So he holds a medical degree. And are you currently in a private consulting business of your own? Yes, that's correct. I am. And before being a private consultant, were you employed by someone? He says, yes, that's correct. I am. Oh, no, sorry. Yes, I was. I read the wrong line. He says, yes, I was. And by whom were you employed before becoming a private consultant? By the United States government. And specifically, what branch of the United States government employed you? I retired from the United States Army in mid-year of 91 after, let me see, my government service is slightly over 31 years. And for how many of those years were you in the United States Army? I was in the United States Army for 15 years and 7 months and the United States Navy. That's interesting. I didn't know too many people transitioned from one to the other. Is that common? I didn't know that. So, anyways, I don't know. That just stopped me in my tracks. So he was in the army. Usually, there's like a mm, kind of a healthy rivalry between all of the different branches, and they kind of secretly, it's not healthy. Like secretly, they really think that they're the best. I mean, it's competitiveness and whatnot, and it's kind of normal in organizations like that. But I don't know. It just threw me. Anyways, he was in the Army for 15 years and 7 months, and the United States Navy for 15 years and 6 months. It's interesting that he has like the exact. He probably knows the days too. And when you were both in the United States Army and the United States Navy, were you in the medical corps of the services? Yes, I was. And when you retired from the United States Army, what rank did you have? Colonel. And for the 10 years before you retired from the United States Army, what was your position with the Army? I was the director of the Wound Ballistics Laboratory at the Letterman Army Institute of Research in San Francisco. Dude's a big deal, just FYI, in what he's doing. And what, sir, was your medical and is your medical specialty? My medical specialty is general surgery, which is a specialty I've practiced. However, I also was fully trained in plastic surgery, but chose to do trauma surgery rather than plastic surgery. Interesting. So let's go back to your educational background, Dr. Fackler. Would you tell us about the schools that you attended and the degrees that you received and the years in which you received them? Yes, I received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Gettysburg College in 1955. Holy. I received after 4 years of college, I received the MD from Yale University of Medicine in 1959 after 4 years there, and that's the degrees. Do you want me to also mention the residency training? Your residency training and your certification. Then I had a 1 year internship, a rotating internship at the University of Oregon Medical Schools and Hospitals in Portland, Oregon. And then I had a 4 year residency in general surgery at the Boston Naval Hospital, immediately followed by a 2 year residency in Bethesda Navy Hospital. I take it you were in the Navy at that time? Yes, that's correct. When did you join the Navy? I actually joined the Navy while I was what was called an Ensign 1995 program, in which we were offered the option of signing up for a particular service in a reserve status. And the advantage of doing that was that we would then know that we would have assurance that we would be called to service immediately after our training ended. At that time, there was a doctor's draft, and if you didn't do this, you might start a residency and then be drafted from the residency, and it was an iffy thing. So I was associated with the Navy from, I guess, the last 2 years of my medical school is when I actually first signed with the Navy. And where did you go on active duty with the Navy after you completed your residency in general surgery? Yes, I did. Was it before you? Well, I'm sorry. Could I? Not after, immediately after my residency in general surgery. I had 2 years training in plastic surgery, as I mentioned. Now, I went on active duty immediately after the plastic surgery residency. And where were you stationed on active duty after those 2 years at the Bethesda Navy Hospital? I was stationed at the Naval Support Hospital in Vietnam. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. Were you there as a combat surgeon in Vietnam? That was my duty, yes, was combat surgery. As a combat surgeon in Vietnam, did you have the opportunity to operate on and treat wounded sailors and Marines with projectile injuries? Yes, not too many sailors, but mostly Marines. And how long was your tour at at that particular combat hospital? That was a 1 year tour from December of 1967 till December of 1968. And after that tour in Vietnam, did you continue to do basically combat surgery at another location? Yes. I was then stationed at the Yak- Yo- Yokosuka, I think. My grandpa was stationed there. At the Naval Hospital there in Japan, and where the combats type of combat surgery we did there was the basic follow up surgery because it was impossible to do the entire surgery from. What I mean by that is, if a person has a surgical problem like a gunshot wound, ordinarily in the United States, stateside, a surgery would operate on this person and then follow this person until they heal their wound, and then you discharge them and they'd be continue a continuity of care. Because of the great number of casualties in Vietnam, we couldn't do that so frequently. On the average of 2 or 3 days after I do a large abdominal operation on someone, he would be sent on to Yokosuka, and I would then lose the follow up because I couldn't see what happened to that patient. And most of the surgical complications, the infections and things that sometimes occur usually not before 5 to 7 days. And so at Yokosuka, I had 3 years, which allowed me to see the other side of the combat surgery that we were deprived of seeing because of the very short stay of the patients in Vietnam. So you could see that what the healing process was like and what the complication process was like, and did that affect the way you performed surgery? Did you learn from that method to apply in the actual surgeries? Well, yes. Practice of surgery is somewhat trial and error. I mean, you do what you think is the best operation and you follow the patients, and some of them there are complications in each of those. You would look back and say, would I do something differently? Sometimes you say yes and sometimes you say no. But in order to learn the most from surgery, you must do that. And to that end, during the Vietnam conflict, there were several. I think there were 5 tri-service war surgery conferences where people from the in-country hospitals, people from the Pacific Command, hospitals like Japan, and also people from the States met in a group to discuss the problems because it was realized that we needed this discussion with the other people. And I was delegate to both the last two of those conferences, which were held in Tokyo 1970 and 1971. Following your 3 years in Japan, what was your next assignment, if you will? Yes, I came back and was assigned to the Naval Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. And were you performing surgery at that hospital at that time? Yes, I was. And how long did you remain at the Naval Hospital in Memphis? I think I was there about 3 years. By the way, during this time that you're in Memphis, are you also performing plastic surgery pursuant to what that 2 year residency that you had obtained? Yes, I was associated with the University of Tennessee as an instructor in the plastic surgery service, and I went to their weekly conferences and I would do some plastic surgeries myself. Mainly, I would do reconstructive type of surgery, which I preferred, but there would be some cosmetic surgery that I would evaluate and refer to down to the university people. And were you involved in any aspect of wound ballistics during the time that you were at the Naval Hospital and teaching at the University of Tennessee during those 3 years? Only a very few cases. The hospital in Memphis is one of the members that cares for a patient population where there was a high degree of violence from gunfire. And so I wouldn't get involved in it on a day-to-day basis, but the more unusual cases would be brought to conference, or I would be called to consult on an occasional case because it was an unusual case and might be, say, a rifle wound similar to what I had seen in Vietnam, because they were not fairly rare in civilian hospitals. So they were fairly rare in civilian hospitals. So they'd call me occasionally on something like that. After that tour in Tennessee, what was your next duty in the armed forces? Yes, then I switched services in order to be stationed at the Germany station. I'm going to try to pronounce that. And you switched services? Is that when you went from the Navy to the Army? Yes. Why was it that you wanted to be stationed in the hospital in Germany? Well, I didn't specifically ask for that hospital. My reason was I wanted to live overseas in a country that spoke German in order to learn the language well. While I was in Vietnam, because of my plastic surgery training, I was sought out by some surgeons who were working on a German hospital ship, the Helgoland, the Helgoland. It was sponsored by the German Red Cross and it was in the Vietnam harbor. So, when we were not busy at Naval Support Activity Hospital, I would go over and help them with reconstructive surgery on mostly on civilian Vietnamese who were hurt as a result of the war. Awful. That's what their mission was. And I got interested in the German's language somewhat out of the necessity to communicate and got some German tapes and I was learning it. And then I decided that as a physician in the military, I could. The army had many stations in Germany where they had large hospitals and the training and experience was just as good in the United States and sort of as a bonus, I could get to learn German. I also had met several people from the Army at the Tri Service War Surgery conferences and was very impressed by the way they had handled the record keeping of the casualties. One, I was somewhat disappointed in the Navy in that I did not receive, while I was in Vietnam, any reports of what had happened to the patients I had operated on, and it was somewhat disappointing. And at the Tri Service War Surgery conferences, I met the consultants in the Army who did, in fact, make sure that the Army surgeons were acquainted with and instructed on what happens to the patients they'd operated on. He kind of rambles too, but I like him. So far, I like him. There's nothing that there's nothing unlikable about him, but he does kind of ramble a bit. All right, so for a number of reasons, you decided you would rather be practicing medicine in the Army at that point. That's true. How long did you remain in Germany before you came back to the United States? 5 years. And during that time, now let me race ahead, you've qualified as an expert in wound ballistics many times, correct? I've actually testified, I think this is the 44th time. And you have been the president of the International Wound Ballistics Association for the past 5 years, correct? Yes, that's true. And was all of your experience up to this point that we're talking about in gaining expertise in wound ballistics, the combat surgery that you did, or were you gaining expertise during these other tours as well? Well, I was gaining far less expertise during these other years because one of the reasons that when I decided I liked trauma surgery, one of the reasons that I was so eager to accept the posting to Vietnam is because I knew it was a very, very active hospital and there's just no place in civilian trauma. It's possible there's just no place in civilian trauma it's possible to see anywhere near the magnitude of injuries that you see. So, for the training aspects of it, you just can't, you can't get in civilian life. So, because of the amount of casualties in Vietnam, he was able to study better, I guess, learn better. Did you, however, continue over the course of these years? Did you get involved in research during these years in wound ballistics, or did that come later? Research in the sense that one of the reasons I wanted to learn to read German was so that I could read in the original language the some of the historical research of that has been done in this field. As a matter of fact, surgeons have written about their experiences on the field of battle ever since there had been firearms. And I felt it would be useful to be able and there are not too many translations available in some of the best works. And so I felt, by reading French and German, I would be able to understand the field a lot better if I could read, for instance, the memoirs of Baron, however you say his name, who was Napoleon's surgeon, and the works of Theodor Kocher, who was a very famous Swiss physician professor who wrote in German and wrote two excellent books on the subject that hadn't there's no translations available, so I had to read them myself. And by the way, I then did publish a paper in one of our major medical journals of the work of Kocher. I wonder if he ever did write a book or translate a book or something because this dude's impressive. I gotta give it up for him because he is impressive. As a result of your continuing involvement in wound ballistics, have you published papers and articles and books concerning wound ballistics? Not books, but book chapters. Chapters in other people's books, but I have published papers and book chapters, yes. And how many publications in the area of wound ballistics have you had published? Well, actually, it's difficult to number. Actually, I keep on my CV a listing of everything I have in print so I can look it up and know when I did it. But in all fairness, many of those are duplicates because there are certain times or certain reasons where I'll publish very close to the same article in several journals because, in order to hit several target audiences, for instance, the emergency room doctors do not read the surgical journals and vice versa. So, if you publish both of them, and the forensic doctors generally don't read the surgery journals, so many of the research things I do have been published in multiple places. This was like too long of an explanation, kind of even like self-deprecating, like, oh, there's a lot on my CV, but I wouldn't count them all because some of them are duplications. And here's why. Here's a long explanation of why. So on my CV, I have listed approximately, it's about almost 190 now. Oh, that is a lot. But in all honesty, now probably about 100 of those, and then the rest of them are repeats and letters to the editor. So about 100 articles and book chapters in this area. Yes, about. That's still a lot. Is there anyone in the United States who has published more than you in this area? I don't think so. And did you, starting in 1981, head up the Wound Ballistics Laboratory at Letterman Army Institute of Research? Yes. And how did you get to become director of that laboratory? Well, I was asked by the Army. I was stationed at Fort Carson when my 20th year in the service came up. And as you know, as 20 years, it's possible to retire. At 20 years, it's possible to retire from the military. And I had intended to do that, but somehow someone in the Medical Research and Development Command had heard of my some expertise in the field of wound ballistics, and because of that, I got a phone call asking if I would consider, instead of getting out of the military, if I would consider going to San Francisco and setting up a wound ballistics program at the Letterman Army Institute of Research and directing that program and staying in the military to do it. Dude's the real deal. The military, the military was like, hey, dude, stay in the military a little longer. We're going to send you to San Francisco. You can run the whole damn thing. Basically, they set up a wound ballistics program and had him direct it, and he was in charge of it. Wow. So they sent me out there to look at the program and, to look at the laboratory, to see the facilities and talk to the commanding officer. And I made up my mind that I would do that and I accepted that position. And what were some of the goals of that laboratory under your directorship? What were you trying to do or accomplish? Well, the Army. It was the Army's main goal in setting up a laboratory for the study of wound ballistics So they will be able to, as best they can, assure that when a person is wounded on the field of battle, they can get the very best medical care available. And there was considerable confusion in the field of wound ballistics, as witnessed in the 1975 edition of the NATO War Surgery Manual, for instance. What? I want to know more about that. Confusion in the field of wound ballistics per NATO's War Surgery Manual. And in order to study the subject, so we could strengthen. Let me restart that sentence. And in order to study, if I could talk, that would be great. And in order to study the subject so we could straighten out the difficulties and rewrite the chapter in that NATO War Surgery Handbook so that the soldier would be so that we could put something in the hand of the surgeon who, in wartime situation, is sent to a war surgery hospital and he comes from a background where he has no training in penetrating wounds. And so there's so much misconception in the field that some of the surgery that they might render would be dangerously excessive unless they are instructed what is proper uh, and not only instructed to do it, but why they do it. And that was the purpose for our research in the publication. So basically, to teach people the proper way to treat wound ballistics and instruct them properly and why, inform them. I like this guy because he's a very he seeks education. Like I have a huge thirst for knowledge. Like when I want to know something, I go all in, and this guy seems like he's the same way. He just wanted to be better versed at the in the field, and all the writings that he needed to read were in German, so he taught himself German. Crazy. Okay. So what forms did the research take that you were doing at Letterman? Well, the first form was to read everything that had been done up to that point. I spent the first 3 months doing nothing but reading the world literature on wound ballistics. I was already familiar with some of it, of course, but in order to, make sure we didn't miss anything, I spent 3 months just working on the literature and then came to the conclusion of what needed to be done. And one glaring problem was that there had been no scientifically valid work done with a tissue stimulant that stimulated tissue. In other words, there had not been a single study where the penetration depth of a particular projectile had been measured or quantified, or the fragmentation potential of a particular projectile. Everything has been done using a very small block of usually gelatin tissue stimulant, and a projectile was fired through that block, and what was left of the projectile or entire projectile would pass through a chronograph, which is a set of screens which measures how fast it traveled. So there would be a chronograph before the 6-inch block and a chronograph after. And by determining how much velocity was lost, you could then put it in a formula and determine the amount of kinetic energy that the bullet lost or the projectile lost going through. This talker needs some oxygen. And the assumption was made that the wounding of the damage of the body to the body was directly proportional to the kinetic energy. And this basically was that the engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground had relied upon for years in their bullet design, etc. I don't know what he just said in the last part. Okay. So let me stop you there for a moment so we can talk about Aberdeen for a moment. What is the Aberdeen facility's purpose? The Proving Ground's purpose? Well, the purpose is mainly to develop a munitions of various sorts. And what's the overriding goal in munitions development in the Army, or goals? Well, I suppose it's to have a munition that incapacitates the enemy soldier sufficiently to be a useful weapon to protect the lives of the soldiers shooting it, and yet not contravene the international conventions like the Convention of 1989, which prohibits the use of expanding bullet, which is a hollow point bullet. I did not know there were rules to war. So, as not to torture, but to disable so your soldiers can be protected. Well, but the disabling is, I think, although this is not something I really got into a great deal, but it's most of the people who write about war consider a disabled soldier more advantageous than a dead soldier, in that a disabled soldier takes much resource from the enemy in order to take care of this person. So, for the military, a bullet that, for instance, goes through someone and causes him to stop fighting but doesn't kill him is a more advantageous wound, a bullet than one that would kill him outright. And have you been involved on some level with what's been designed and developed at Aberdeen over the years? Not necessarily Aberdeen, but in the military and other places, Aberdeen is not the sole place that this is being done. I have kept abreast with the various places that things are being developed in weaponry in the military, yes. Are you aware of any shotgun research that was done at Aberdeen in the 1970s? No, I'm not. Do you believe that they bothered doing any shotgun research at Aberdeen? I have never read any, and I would think it is most unlikely. The shotgun is a weapon that is used periodically by very specialized groups in the military, but very, very few compared to rifles. And I think the work done at Aberdeen, the small arms area at Aberdeen, would be, as far as I knew, universally rifles and the development of rifle munition. And then, of course, they have the larger calibers, like the cannons and that sort of thing. Okay, now he's just rambling. Okay, so now there are members of the Army who work at Aberdeen who are engineers involved with designing munitions, correct? Yes, the ordnance engineers, yes. Now you've been reading, have you not, the testimony of Roger McCarthy as it's unfolded in this trial? Yes, I have. Usually, by the way, it's rare to have the transcript in real time basically handed over to you. Sometimes you can pay a lot extra to have a transcript provided overnight, or, well, I would think it would have to be overnight. So the clerk courts would do their notes and somebody has to do notes at night, because if you've noticed, there are multiple clerk courts. Uh, Court clerks, I mean to say, on this transcript listed on here. So maybe one, or maybe they both do. I don't know. How would you do that? One would have to do notes, one would have to do the typing of the transcript at night. So, yeah, I don't know. Something along those lines. But I don't know how they do it. But, anyways, she's getting it done, and they're having the transcript done overnight, which, like I said, it's a rare thing because you really have to pay for it. But it's good to have, because especially in a retrial when you've got multiple testimonies to go through sometimes for certain witnesses. So he says, I have met him. Yeah, so he met Dr. McCarthy. And based on his description of what he was doing at his branch school at Aberdeen, was he in any way, shape, or form involved in ordnance design? No, it was my impression that he was there as a student. And when he testified that he was taught how to fire everything in the Army and maintain it, does that mean he learned how to clean them? Objection calls for hearsay, lack of foundation. The court says, on the later grounds, sustained. Lack of what? Foundation as to how he would know this. Miss Aronson says, you know what's taught at the Aberdeen training facility, don't you? Objection, no foundation, overruled. Are you familiar with the course programs there? No, I'm not familiar with the course programs there. What I am familiar with is Dr. McCarthy's testimony, however, in which he did, I think, testify that one of the things that they did was maintain weapons. What is, in the Army use of that term, what does maintain weapons mean? Well, mostly keeping them clean, but it can be repairing and replacing defective parts also. Now, you indicated that the laboratory at Letterman, what you set out to do was to try to, on one aspect, test these theories that the energy produced by the projectile entering the human body was somehow related to the degree or severity of the wounding. Yes. Was that a conception that was commonly held? Very commonly. Was that one of those things that you previously referred to as a common misconception in the field? Yes, it is. And what were some of the other misconceptions in the field that you are seeking to test or prove at Letterman? Well, one of the common misconceptions is that rifles of they call, say, high velocity, unspecified exactly what high velocity is. But generally, people will write about rifle wounds as, quote, high velocity wounds, and that these wounds cause damage around the wound path that exceeds what is visually obvious, and that in order to treat these wounds adequately, you must remove all the tissue around the wounds. So you have to basically dissect the person to get the wound, to open up the wound all the way to get to the pellets or whatever. So, yeah. You must remove all of the tissue around the wounds. And this is basically what we were seeking to disprove because this could certainly result in very wide excision of tissue that is quite healthy. So he's saying you don't have to remove all the tissue. That's how it's been in the past, but he's saying there's other ways. So he's got other methods. So what methods did you devise at the laboratory to test these theories of velocity and wounding? Well, the first thing that we did was try to figure out a scientific way of measuring the potential of a given projectile, like mostly bullets, and the first thing we had to do was calibrate a tissue stimulant. This had been unfortunately not done. As I mentioned, the people at Aberdeen and other places had been shooting small 6-inch blocks of ordnance gelatin, which is a substance that looks a bit like yellowish jello. It's translucent, and you can indent it with your finger. However, there in searching, I was unable to find any place that it had ever been calibrated against human tissue, and therefore the relationship was invalid unless it had some relationship with human tissue, and that had not been established. So this gelatin that's basically been the norm for the industry, the field, is this gelatin, which is nothing like human tissue. There's no comparisons, there's nothing to explain why this gelatin should be used in place of human tissue, other than you don't want to shoot a human. That's not good enough because it's not comparable. The substance, the thickness, the everything about it. It's soft. He could put his finger through it, he says. So the first thing that we did was to calibrate it using penetration depth of the projectile. We shot a known projectile into the upper thigh of an anesthetized 200-pound pig and measured the penetration depth of a group of 5 of these projectiles, each in a different pig. And then what we did is in mixing the gelatin, we mixed a gelatin that matched the penetration depth. So we started out with 20% gelatin, which is had been the commonly used one, and found it didn't penetrate deeply enough. So, yeah, didn't penetrate deep enough. And we went down to 2% steps at a time until we found 10 degrees, No, I'll get to that. The 10% gelatin was the gelatin if shot at 4 degrees centigrade, which is 39 degrees Fahrenheit. In this, you have to specify the temperature because gelatin changes its properties at the temperature as the temperature changes. So I arbitrarily established we were going to use 4 degrees centigrade or 39 degrees Fahrenheit for the reason that that was most everybody's refrigerator is set to, and it would be easy for everyone who wanted to do it. If they had a refrigerator, they could do our techniques. Other studies had used such things as 10 degrees centigrade, which is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. If you want to do that, you have to buy a very special laboratory refrigerator to do it. We wanted everyone doing the research to get the specific methodology online. Not online like the internet, on like in be able to do it. Now, did these scientific methods and these research designs that you came up with at Letterman become accepted in the area of wound ballistics research? Yes, they did. The 10% gelatin at the 4 degrees centigrade was, I think, 1987. The FBI switched from the 20% to this gelatin, and they right now, approximately, that I know of, approximately 50 forensic laboratories in the world that are doing studies using gelatin, and all of them, to my knowledge, are using our techniques. The most are in Canada, Regina, Saskatchewan. We worked with them to get the gelatin right. I work with many of the laboratories because it's a little bit tricky to get the mixing the gelatin and some things, little tricks. So I spent a lot of time on the telephone with people who are using the technique in the beginning when they're using it. His long-winded answers. Are there other experiments that you performed at Letterman or in affiliation with Letterman that other laboratories and researchers have also accepted your methods on, duplicated the research, or attempted to? Well, yes. We, well, there's one other step that I must mention. After the first calibration of the gelatin, we published this and we published some results of projectiles that had gone or a specific depth with this gelatin. And as I had hoped, other investigators picked up on the technique and started doing their own studies. And then I got some calls from the investigators saying, we're using your technique and not getting the same results, and we're getting much deeper depths of penetration than you are. And then we had to find out why this was, and we found out it was the way that they were making their gelatin. The gelatin, unbeknownst to me, we get the very large 25-pound drum of gelatin powder, and unbeknownst to me, there were no directions with this. I thought there were directions because we had directions, but my assistant, noting there were no directions, called the company and got the directions and put them in there. I assumed everybody has directions. Cause, Kind, and Knox, who makes the gelatin, doesn't. Because Kind and Knox, who makes the gelatin, doesn't. Only if you get them in little bitty baggies. And that's the problem. The directions that Kind and Knox gives you for making says always start with cold water. Unfortunately, when an investigator would get a batch of the gelatin powder and not know there are no directions, first thing we would do is ask his wife, and she'd look on the little thing, and I think it says to start with boiling water. Yes. So the jello, I think that you make at home, you start with boiling water. This stuff, you need to start with cold water. So it's quite different. Okay. The problem is gelatin is an animal tissue and it gets denatured when it's heated too much. Like things soften up when they get cooked. That's what was happening. So then we had to publish another paper and we had to design a method of calibrating each block of gelatin to make sure it was made right. And so we did this just by using a $50 or maybe $30 pumped up BB gun. The ones you can vary the velocity by pumping them, and we found that it was that if we shot a BB gun at 590 feet per second into the gelatin, we established the 8.5 centimeters per penetration depth as the standard, and that has now been used. And there's recently been a book brought out on the a new penetration model done. This book's been done by a friend of mine, and he's using the methodology and the calibration method. And he's also publishing a way of adjusting the results in so-called non-standard gelatin. There are certain people that get the gelatin and their BB goes 10 centimeters. In order to keep them from throwing it out, he's been able to calculate how much difference they have to make in the adjustment of their results to match it up. So, anyhow, we've calculated two ways. One calibrated against living tissue, which had not been done. And secondly, we calibrated each block of gelatin before that block is shot. And the astounding thing is that this had not been done before because there is no more complex. This is no more complex than in quantitative analysis using a known weight to calibrate your scales. Just basic 1A science, but in the field of wound ballistics, it had been neglected. And now the FBI uses it. So this was never done before. This guy came up with it, and now it's the standard. So, what ultimately were the areas of research that you were able to utilize this technology in your investigations? I mean, what has been learned because of these techniques that you developed about the effects of, I mean, I don't want you to list everything because I'm sure it's a lot, but how did this research affect some of the problems of the common misconceptions? Okay. Could I explain the first one, the main one, by going to the board? Sure. Let me get a clean piece of paper, though. There's a bunch of stuff on that. Let me get you a clean piece of paper, Dr. Fackler. He says, as I mentioned, one of the common misconceptions is that a bullet of, quote, high velocity, for instance, let's take an M16 rifle bullet. This velocity is high by anybody's definition, about 32,000 feet per second. These projectiles hitting upon hitting someone will cause very widespread damage, and even though the hole appears small, you must remove a certain area around the hole. And the assumption is that, of course, from when they hit, they make all this damage. Well, when we wound what we or when we wound what we did with our, again, to back up a little bit, instead of using 6-inch blocks of gelatin, we used 20-inch blocks of gelatin. So our what we did was entrapped the entire path of any projectile in the block. So there had been some projectiles that we've had to use the 3 of these 20-inch blocks to catch it, but without this, you don't know what the penetration potential is. And you also find out other things about as the bullet goes through, if the bullet mushrooms or expands, or if it does a thing called yawing. And military rifle bullets do not expand in the sense they're soft point bullets, which double their diameter and flatten and make a larger wound because of that. Military rifle bullets don't do that, but military rifle bullets do a thing called yaw, and that is after they hit the tissue, they'll penetrate a certain distance, and then the bullet will begin to turn sideways, and there will be a point where the bullet is traveling sideways to its path, of course. When it's doing that, it's making more damage because there are only two things a bullet does. One, it crushes what it can hit, and secondly, it makes a temporary cavity, which is just a splash. When you throw a rock in the water goes apart and comes back. The splash in tissue is a temporary cavity. Those are the two things a bullet does. When a bullet is going, a streamlined bullet, such as the military ball round like an M16, looks something like that. It's made very streamlined in order to go through the air and disturb the air little so that it doesn't lose much velocity and holds velocity very well. If it shot it with the base forward, it would lose speed very rapidly. In going through tissue, as long as the bullet remains that way, it makes a very tiny little hole and it doesn't disturb much tissue either. When it goes sideways, it makes a big splash or big temporary cavity, and the M16 bullet also breaks. This is no more complex than a diver going off of a very high board, making a very good dive and very tiny splash because she hits at a streamline. Even off a low board, low velocity, if you hit sideways, you make a big splash. No more complex than this. So, I mean, that's kind of a good example to make it make sense to the lay folk like us. And and he continues on, what we did with the gelatin is measure where the bullet did various things. And I'll use the M16 because that's a very well-known bullet and it was commonly used in Vietnam. And the wound profile, which is what we got from taking the entire length of the projectile, measuring the diameters of the disruption at every point, and we constructed what we called a profile. And we made this profile by I would take the measurements from the gelatin, rough them out on a piece of cardboard or paper, and then our artist would make these profiles. And I have all these profiles, which there's a characteristic wound pattern for each projectile. I'll just draw the M16 because this makes the point that I'm trying to speak of here. And it goes like this. Mr. Khan says, I would object at this time, Your Honor, to further examination concerning bullets, since the projectiles in this case are shotgun pellets rather than bullets. The court says, overruled with the understanding that if there is much more beyond this, it'll go on to the shotgun pellets. Okay. Ms. Emerson says, well, we'll talk about the connection, Your Honor. One moment. Let me ask you a question. Dr. Fackler, what you're trying to demonstrate now is the concept of the temporary cavitation, correct? The temporary cavitation. Yes, and I'm trying to demonstrate the concept of how we prove the error in the idea that a bullet of high velocity always making a lot of damage and therefore that you must do a large operation. That's the basic application that you asked me, which is right. With respect to the concept of temporary cavity, is that a concept that when we get to it in a little while enters into your evaluation into the wounds in this case? Oh, certainly. Oh, absolutely. But the point here is that the distance until, as long as this bullet is going straight, it makes a very small hole, and this cavity is very small. In other words, and in distance for the average distance, an M16 penetrates before it yaws and makes the large cavity. When the bullet yaws and goes sideways, we have a big splash, and the bullet fragments, and you have a lot of damage in here. That very clearly does occur. However, in the M16, ordinarily this takes about 4 inches of penetration before this happens, actually a little more than 4. It's 12 centimeters before this happens. So, in other words, what I'm saying is if you put a human leg up on this profile, it would come to about there. In other words, I treated many, many wounds from an M16 where it shot right through the inside in one leg, out the other, and the soldier walked in without any difficulty, and there's no way in the world one could tell that wound from was made from a simple handgun or 22. But the teaching was if it was high velocity, you had to do a huge operation. And what we've been now successful in trying to get the point across is no, you don't treat what you thought the velocity was. You look at the wound and treat the damage you see, and you don't go excising a lot of excess damage. And that was the point that we made, or that we have been successful in getting across from the wound profile. So he's pretty um, instrumental in starting the idea, making this idea common within the field that you don't have to excise a wound when you see the bullets. You don't have to, when it's straight on, a high velocity going straight on would do less damage on the outside. So you don't have to go in and like start to take it apart, damage the top part of the skin to see what's inside. He's saying like this is now the new norm. You don't have to do a dissection of that area. So you were able to show that from those kinds of bullets that the first 4 inches, no matter what the velocity, really isn't an exceedingly damaging projectile. It's only when it turns. Right. This is for the M16, of course, and there are other common projectiles, the AK-47, that goes 12 inches before it yaws, which is very fortunate because it makes very small wounds compared to other projectiles. Now, as a result of that, strike that, were there other concepts and notions that you were addressing in the research at Letterman? I mean, without listing them all, because we're not going to do that, but other areas that were studied concerning the impact of projectiles on the human body. It was basically the idea of trying to get across that we're looking for a lesson that we could back up with scientific certainty so we could publish. And the lesson was that for the soldier, for the surgeon that's treating the soldier, is that you cannot tell what what a projectile's wounding potential is going to be by its velocity. And therefore, you have to look at the wound and examine the wound and use x-rays, and you can determine from that, but just velocity won't do it, and that was mainly what we were doing. And that was what the Army wished to do. And this is the setting up of the basic research. To set up the methodology is one thing, and then the next thing was actually applying this to the field of battle. And as a matter of fact, this appears to be the most current issue of the Emergency War Surgery Manual, which is the 1988 edition, Government Printing Office, the 1988 edition. All right, so even our government is using his standards. Now, have you held various honorary positions and elected positions within professional organizations in the area of wound ballistics? Well, not very many professional organizations, but of the few, yes, I've. Are there many professional organizations? Not in wound ballistics, not wound ballistics alone. It's a very narrow field, actually, and the only ones I know of are the International Wound Ballistics, which I'm president and editor of the journal, and a second one, which has been formed in the last year, is the French Wound Ballistics Society, and I was selected honorary president of that. So he's the real deal when it comes to wound ballistics. And are you a regular reviewer for medical and forensic science journals? Yes. Are you a consultant to the United States Department of Defense and Department of State Forensics Science Criminalist Industry, the FBI, and other law enforcement agencies of the area of wound ballistics? Yes, I am. Have you been selected to be a member of various United States delegation? Well, you've indicated you were selected to be a member of Army delegations. That was the United States. That was Department of State. I was loaned to the Department of State to go down to Geneva. While in Germany, I went down to Geneva and was the medical member to a United Nations conference on weapons. Holy crap. That was regarding the M16, which was one of the big bone of contentions during that conference. Have you received any medals from the Army work that you've, for your work in the Army? Yes, I got the Meritorious Medal of Service for the research, the scientific research of basically establishing the valid tissue simulant. And then I got the Legion of Merit for the application of our work in the field of battle to the application of how to treat battle wounds. And as a private consultant, have you become involved in the area of wound ballistics in a forensic setting, in other words, in a legal setting? Yes, I have. I started that while I was still, after our methodology came on, and we published a couple of papers with the wound profiles, and therefore you could look at a wound profile and find out how deeply a projectile penetrates it. I got a call from, I think it was the first time I testified in a case, and someone actually It was a firearms examiner who had felt that this would be applicable, and he talked to the lawyer in. I went down to Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1984 and testified on a case. And while I was in the military from 84 to 91, I think I only testified in about 5 cases because the military does not encourage you to do this. But they don't prohibit it when you're dealing with a field that is not, well, there's no one else that had this available, and they felt it was okay for me to testify because the it was unavailable somewhere else, the expertise. So the government doesn't make it a habit of allowing their own military personnel to be experts in cases. However, they allowed it because he's the only one with this expertise, is basically what he just said in a whole lot of words. In other words, there are no civilian experts, not in this specific area. Okay. And since the time you retired from the Army, you've had more time to act as a forensic consultant. Yes, I would estimate that approximately 50% of my time is spent as a forensic consultant right now. And in what kinds of cases involving what kinds of firearms? All of these involve firearm injuries. All of the cases you've been involved in? I hesitate to say yes without thinking. Certainly, the great majority of them do. One of them involved body armor, but it was fire. So, firearm impact on the body armor was an important part of it. All of them have involved firearms. All different kinds of firearms? Yes. Now, this description you have given about the effects of when a high speed projectile, in this case the M16 bullet, passes through human tissue, it creates this cavity. Does the research indicate that the same kind of effects or some of the same effects occur when other projectiles pass through the bodies? Other firearm projectiles besides the M16 bullet? Oh, certainly. Any projectile that passes through the body at probably faster than 500 feet per second will give a cavitation or splash of the tissue to some degree. And everything else being equal, the higher the speed of the projectile, the larger the cavitation will be. Now, with respect to shotgun wounds, which is what's involved in this case, do these theories that you worked out at the Letterman Institute apply equally to shotgun wounds? If I could, I don't know if it's proper for me to comment on the format of your question or not. Please, if it's a bad question, say it's a bad question. Well, I don't consider these are things we can measure and prove the high speed photography beyond the theories or facts. I didn't mean to denigrate the research. Okay. These facts that you have developed in your research, do they apply as well to penetration of the human body with shotgun ammunition? Certainly they do. Well, have you ever been called upon, Dr. Fackler, in your capacity as a consultant in the forensic area to contribute your expertise in the attempt to reconstruct a shooting? I have never been asked to do that entirely on my own. And, well, I think, yeah, I have been asked to do that entirely on my own, and I've refused and suggested that I would be happy to assist the firearms examiner, and we could do it together. So he doesn't step out of his lane like Dr. McCarthy, who is an expert in everything. This guy is he knows what his expertise is. He knows he's an expert in the firearms aspect, and he says, I can assist with that part, but, or with the ballistics wounds part, but I need the firearms examiner to do the recreation. We'll do it together based on our combined expertise. Because that's basically a firearms examiner generally does that. Not all firearms examiners, but there are certain examiners who specialize in that. And what I've done is in each case that I've been asked, I've combined with a firearms expert. More recently, in a case up in Vancouver, Canada, I've done that. And what was the case in Vancouver? The police had pulled around a person who was stopped, and they have this technique when the police car pulls around the stopped car in such a fashion that the front of the police car blocks the forward movement of the car. I don't know what they call it, but it's a standard police technique. And in pulling around the car, I guess the driver of the car applied the brakes a little bit more abruptly, unexpected, and the passenger policeman had a handgun in his hand, and he was thrown forward against the dashboard, and the handgun hit the dashboard and went off. His window was open. The bullet went through the window, hit the passenger in the neck, cut his spinal cord, so he became a paraplegic or quadriplegic. Wow, what bad luck and timing, and that's awful. Was the issue whether or not this was an accidental firing of the handgun? That's what it turned into, yes. And was their testimony from yourself and from a firearms examiner attempting to reconstruct the manner in which that gun was fired, or, well, we haven't. The reconstruction has been done. The point in dispute is the person who was shot makes the claim that he saw the police standing out there. The policeman got out of the car, stood there, and shot him. What we did was reconstruct this with the person in the car, and he had his seatbelt on, and it came across his shoulder, and the bullet went through the seatbelt. And we had the car of the person where the bullet entered, and by putting him in various positions, we were able to reconstruct a scene that lined up very well with it coming out of the car as it was going by, but did not line up well with the policeman standing where he said he saw the policeman standing. So that's why we did it. Makes sense. So you took all the known facts and you were able to indicate whether one version fit the physical evidence versus another version that did not fit the physical evidence. Precisely. Concerning this case, Dr. Fackler, if you had been asked to attempt to reconstruct all of the components of the shooting in this case, the number of shots fired, the placement of the shooters, the placement of the decedents, would you have accepted such an assignment? Mr. Khan says, objection, irrelevant, lack of foundation. The court says, rephrase the question. Ms. Abramson says, in your professional opinion, is this a scene that you believe can be reconstructed scientifically? Once again, I would object to lack of foundation, overruled. The witness says, no, I don't believe it can because of the tremendous number of variables involved, which we've been saying, and she's been trying to get that point across with Dr. McCarthy because everything in his illustrations, everything in his motion, his diagrams that are supposed to depict motion in like within seconds, there's just way too many variables, and they only tried to reconstruct it one way. They said, "Oh, they're seated. It's this way." So they didn't, they didn't accept any of the other variables or ruled anything out that didn't go along with their narrative, basically. Ms. Aronson says, now you're aware that a hypothesis of reconstruction has been offered in this case by Roger McCarthy. Are you not? Yes, I am. And in your opinion, is that a scientific reconstruction? Well, that's difficult. I think we can say the attempt to do it was done in as scientific a fashion as Dr. McCarthy was able to do. But I do not feel that he's being really, really nice. It does not meet the criterion for the scientifically done reconstruction because of the many errors made in it. So not only did he speculate on all of the different positions, but he also admitted that there are errors and things that uh, might not be accurate in his depictions. Based on your own involvement in reconstructed shootings, are there certain areas of expertise that someone attempting to do that must prepossess or must consult with before a scientific reconstruction of a shooting can be done with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty? Mr. Khan says, objection, a lack of foundation and calls for speculation. Court says, overruled. The witness says, well, certainly, in a situation where you have, for instance, a hole in an inanimate object and a known position of where the gun was, or if you line up holes in inanimate objects, fine. I think that's something an engineer can do without any difficulty. A mechanical engineer, which that is he deals with machines, things, not humans. He deals with inanimate objects. A mechanical engineer. A biomechanical engineer deals with the human body and how physics affects the human body. So, how the bullets would affect the human body. So that would be a biomechanical engineer's responsibility. A mechanical engineer could testify to, say, how a bullet may have hit the remote control or the wall, the couch, whatever, but not necessarily people. Anyways, the witness continues on. But when you're talking about paths in and through the human body, I don't think the engineer has the knowledge necessary to understand the subject well enough to do an accurate job, which Ms. Abramson has been trying to get that point across as well with McCarthy on the stand. Mr. Khan says objection motion to strike the later half based upon lack of foundation and improper opinion. And that is overruled. Finally, we get some kind of good win there because that definitely shouldn't have been sustained given the fact that he's already said that he doesn't do those, but he works closely with firearms examiners who do the reconstruction with him. And it's a combined effort. So he's already given his answer and his foundation for that. But anyways, moving on. Ms. Abramson says, now is the knowledge of injuries inside the human body something that both surgeons and forensic pathologists, is that something both of those areas have training in? Yes, they do. And in this particular case, well, first, did you have submitted to you a large body of materials over the last 3 months? Yes, I have. And have you also been reading the testimony of Dr. Robert Lawrence and Roger McCarthy? Yes, I have. And did you form certain opinions and conclusions concerning some of the opinions and conclusions that Drs. Lawrence and Dr. McCarthy arrived at? Yes. And did you discuss, and if you will, bounce off those opinions and conclusions with some other people who are also involved in the examination of forensic evidence? Objection calls for hearsay. Overruled, you can answer the question because, yeah, experts sometimes value the opinions of other experts to get information and yeah. The witness says yes. Did you at various times consult with Charles Morton, a criminalist who heads up the Institute of Forensic Science in Oakland? We will hear from Charles Morton as well in this coming week. He says, yes, he spoke with Charles Morton. Have you consulted with and discussed aspects of the case that Deputy Dwight Van Horn from the LA County Sheriff's Department, who was the ballistics examiner in this case in the first trial? Objection assumes facts, not an evidence. Sustained. Have you discussed aspects of this case with Deputy Van Horn? Yes, I have. And have you known Deputy Van Horn for a number of years? Yes, I have. How do you know him? I'm not sure how I. Deputy Van Horn is a member of the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners, and this is an organization in which I am a technical advisor and have recently become a distinguished member and remain a member and technical advisor. Damn, he is like the goat of this topic, if you haven't already noticed. And I've gone to the yearly meetings of this organization for, oh, at least the last 6 years, if not more. And Deputy Van Horn, I think the first time I met at the Association of Firearm and Tool Marks Examiners yearly meeting. Deputy Van Horn and I have also collaborated on some research that we do yearly. There's a weekend that a group of us are invited down to Yuma, proving the Yuma Proving Ground in Yuma, Arizona in the fall, and the people in ordnance down there, the small arms ordnance, who are interested in firearms, put at our disposal their very expensive and highly sophisticated equipment, such as a radar chronograph that can take the instantaneous velocity of any projectile from the time it's fired until it comes to rest. And we've done this yearly for, I think, the last 4 years. And I think Deputy Van Horn was at the first two of these, and I've known him there. And I've chatted with him periodically on other cases. I've done a few cases for the LA Sheriff's Department. So they've worked a lot together. Now, when you say you've done a few cases for the LA Sheriff's Department, what sort of cases were those? Gunshot wound cases. And were these cases that were in litigation, or was this to assist them in investigations? Well, actually, I've done both. Some of them have come to completion without going to court, and others have gone to court, and I would say I probably have testified for the LA Sheriff's Department probably at least 6 times. So this is so-called officer-involved shooting cases? Yes, it was. Were these civil cases or criminal cases or both? I think these were all civil cases. And this is where the sheriff's department was being sued? That's correct. And were you testifying on behalf of the sheriff's department with respect to the proper use of a weapon by the deputy sheriffs involved? No, I wasn't dealing with the proper use. All I was doing was the angle work, as we talked about earlier. In lining up a given shot would have gone through a body at a given angle, and there would be two stories. One case in which a person came out of a door and a handgun in his hand, and the one side of the story said that he was standing there upright and his arm at his side, and he was shot through by the police and was killed. And the police version was that they fired at him because he assumed a crouched position with the handgun in front of him, pointed at him, and they shot at him because of that. And it happened to be on a fairly level terrain, and fortunately, the bullet behind him went into a wall so we could establish the bullet, and the angle of the chest was downward at 30 degrees, which makes it impossible for him to be standing upright, but when he assumes the crouch position, the upper torso leans forward about 30 degrees. That's just an example of the kind of thing that would be called upon to do, that I would be called upon to do. Basically, you get the defense's theory and the prosecution's theory, and either side has different version of the story, and he's there to determine which side is which side lines up with the science. That's what a good expert does, is look at the science and determine which way it plays out. You're not supposed to come up with an idea first and then make your science fit that, because that's pretty much what Dr. McCarthy has done. Would you say that most of I think you said 46 cases? I think this is the 44th case. So 44 cases that you've testified in, have most of them been civil cases? Actually, no, there have been about an even split. It was a year ago that I did the count, and I don't think it's changed much since then. But at that time, it was about an even split, half criminal and half civil. And in the criminal cases, have you testified on behalf of the prosecution in criminal cases? About 50% of the time. And the other 50% of the time, you've testified on behalf of the defendants? Yes. Again, he's not picking sides, he goes with where the science goes. And was it a particular class of defendants on whose behalf you have previously testified in criminal cases? I don't understand the question. I'm sorry. Was it mainly police officers? In the criminal cases, no, not in the criminal cases, in the civil cases. So it's mainly police officers? It's mainly police officers, but not in criminal. So in the criminal cases, it's a variety, just a variety. Now, when we begin, well, first of all, you were retained by the defense as a court appointed expert by the County of Los Angeles. Is that correct? Yes, that's my understanding. And is it also your understanding that only a certain amount of money was allocated for your services as a flat fee, no matter how many hours you actually put in or what you usually charge? That is my understanding also. So basically, they were, because at this point, all the money is dried up with the family and the estate, and it's wrapped up in things, and they've already owed from the first trial and whatnot, so there's no money left. This time, I believe they're indigent. I believe it's all, she just said that the County of Los Angeles is paying for his expert services. However, they only stipend a certain amount for his services, no matter how much he does. So they've severely limited him. Again, that's one limitation that we see with this case. They don't have the money like they did in the first case. And the court is apparently limiting what the experts on the defense can do. So he says, yes, that was his understanding. And what do you usually charge for your work in this area? 250 an hour. Have you kept track of the hours that you have put into this case at that point? No, I've just not bothered because it doesn't make any difference. So you've long since passed the. Yes, I've long since. So he's gone way past the limit. Now, when you were first appointed to assist the defense in this case, were you provided with a report from Failure Analysis Associates signed by Dr. McCarthy and Mr. Grewal? Yes, I was. And was there in that report some glaring misconceptions about how projectiles fired by firearms interact with the human body? Yes. And could you name what those misconceptions were? Mr. Khan says, I would object at this point. Calls for hearsay unless the testimony was presented during this trial. Then Miss Abramson says, it was, Your Honor. The court says, all right, let's rephrase it then. Miss Abramson says, okay. Was there expressed in that report the notion that someone hit in the head with a round of shotgun ammunition would be knocked flat? Yes. Is that true? As a general rule, no. It's a possibility, but one cannot say it would happen. Again, like that was his assuming you get hit with a gunshot and you fall. But he tried to clean that up, Dr. McCarthy, like admitting that yeah, it's not really true, but it was in their report apparently. So, with respect to the shot in question here, was that described in that report as shots to the frontal lobes with respect to Mrs. Menendez? Yes, it was described as an actual penetration of the frontal lobe. And was there, from any of the medical evidence that you reviewed, is there any indication there was any penetration of the frontal lobes? No. The x ray would be the thing that would prove this, and in the head we have two views, front to back, and also view from the side, so we can tell. And on the view from the front, there appears that there is a buckshot right in the middle of the forehead, and it appears that having no other evidence, one would say, well, that can be in the frontal lobe, but it could be right under the skin here, right in the skin, in the back, or anywhere in between. And you have to have a view from the side to find out where it is in line and where on that one line it is, whatever that means. And when the view from the side is shown, that particular buckshot is flattened out in the front of the skull and did not penetrate the skull. And would that it's flattened out over the sinus bone? Yeah, it's flattened out over the outer wall of the frontal sinus where the bone is somewhat thinner than it would be some elsewhere because what the sinus is a space between the two layers of bone. So the bone is fairly thin. For that, it's flattened out without penetrating that thin bone. And so does that indicate that it is not the kind of projectile injury that could knock someone flat? Well, it certainly didn't go into the frontal lobe, but there's another level of error. Even if it had gone in the frontal lobe, there's still no evidence that it would have caused the person to become incapacitated because there's lots of instances of people being shot in the frontal area of the brain and remaining conscious and functional, which is true. Like I've watched, if you've never seen the show, I Survived. It's an old show. It is fantastic. It's well written. It's really well done. It's like people basically there's like three individuals on the show. They're telling like three separate stories, and the person's just sitting there. It's just the camera and them, and they're talking about a horrific situation that they survived. Basically, I Survived. It's the show. And it used to be on Lifetime, maybe, or TLC. Yeah, one of those shows. I think you can stream it now on things. But anyways, it was um it was so well done, and they didn't do like dramatic whatevers of it. It was just like it was just their reading of it or just their interpretation of it, and they would tell the three different stories. And sometimes there would be people who survived getting shot in the head. Like a lot of the I Survived stories were people who survived some actual, gunshots to the head, which I find just incredible. So, yes, you can still survive. You can live with shot to the brain. Sometimes multiple shots to the brain, just depending on how lucky you get. Not that I am recommending you go out and do this and try it for yourselves, but it's something that is definitely a thing. All right, so the next question is, did you write an article at one time, Dr. Fackler, in which you talked about the fact that many medical professions even have some erroneous notion that that if somebody is hit with a bullet, it knocks them backwards? Yes, the environs where we're in here, I think, has been largely responsible for that misconception because it's very common in movies to see a person when they're hit by a bullet to be knocked backwards, and this just does not happen. And it does not happen when they're hit with shotgun pellets the way Mrs. Menendez was struck with with wound number two, as Dr. Golden calls it, either. Isn't that true? Yes, it does not happen. And this is not something that anybody has to take it at because I, as an expert, tell them because it's very, very easy to prove. And we have done this. And we at my laboratory took a large sack and filled it with 185 pounds of sandbags and hung it from something. I'm not sure what in our laboratory. And this is a bag that weighs as much as most average persons. And you can take the heel of your hand and push it and easily start it swinging back and forth. And certainly, if a shotgun was going to propel a person, it would move this bag significantly. But when you settle this bag down and shoot it with a shotgun, it doesn't move significantly. If you look very closely, it starts into an arc of maybe an inch. It just doesn't move. And the physics are very easily available to prove this. I mean, but the easiest way, I think, to explain it is to use that example because anybody can do it if they want to check it out. I'm shocked. Like, I thought that a shotgun blast would definitely knock someone back too. So this is kind of news to me. I mean, I would understand like not all of them would, and depending on the impact and how severe, but just like straight up shotgun to a sandbag hanging there and it barely moves. I'm surprised by that experiment. Anyways, if the impact was that strong out of the one end of the shotgun to knock people over, would that this recoil be strong enough to? Yes, based on Newton's law, it certainly would. So if bullets really did knock people over, shooters would be knocked over too. Yes. Miss Abramson says, Your Honor, this would be a good place. The court says, All right, we'll take our recess. We'll resume at 1:30. Don't discuss this matter with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about it. We'll resume at 1:30. And this is where we will end for the day. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please don't forget to hit the like, comment, subscribe, share, whatever your desires are. Do all those YouTube things. It helps the algorithm, and I would really appreciate it since I don't get a lot of traction on this case, even though I think it's really important to look at old cases and review them and see what things we may not have done right so that we can fix them in the future. That's my opinion, but what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. We will continue on with Dr. Fackler in tomorrow's episode. Bye, guys.